Now that we have a basic understanding of how to create geometry in Rhino and how to control the transformation and manipulation of our geometry, let's try and apply these ideas to a precedent study. We will be examining an architectural pavilion by Bjarke Ingels, otherwise known as BIG, commissioned by the Serpentine Gallery in London. The Serpentine Pavilion by BIG was built in 2016 in the Kensington Gardens in London. The concept for the design of the building was an unzipped wall that was transformed from straight line to three-dimensional space, creating a multifunctional structure that housed a cafe, family activities, and a program of performative works by artists, writers, and musicians. The pavilion consists of a stacked collection of extruded fiberglass frames. When viewed from different angles, the pavilion can appear transparent or solid, and this play of opacity and transparency is intended to provoke a reconsideration of how we perceive space and form. So let's have a go at making this in Rhino. Let's come into perspective mode and create a base module for this. Now, the module of the pavilion is approximately 500 by 500 by 400 in height, so let's create our box for that. And let's do a zoom selected to reorient. Next, let's array this module to create a flat version of the unzipped wall to get the approximate scale. I know that the wall has 53 modules in the Y direction and 34 modules in the Z direction. So let's use array linear to create our 53 modules. And then we'll do a zoom extents. And now we'll select them all and we'll do another array linear in the Z direction for the 34 modules. And now I've got an approximate scale of the size of the pavilion. Next, we want to add the curvature to the wall. I've got an image of the pavilion in plan, and we're going to try and trace the curvature of this image. Now, there's a few ways we could bring this image into Rhino. We could type in the picture command, and we'll be prompted with a dialog box to specify an image we want to bring in. Or we can simply copy an image to our clipboard. So I'm going to right-click on this image and select copy. And then go Control-V into Rhino. And then it's going to ask me to specify the corner and the starting point of this image. So I'm going to select the picture, and I'm going to move from this corner here, and I'm going to align it with the corner of the geometry we've set up. Next, let's rotate the picture from that point again, and we're going to align it to this straight length in plan, and then we're going to line that up and rotate it to the direction of the dummy wall we've created. And the last thing we want to do with the picture is scale it. So let's scale from this starting point again, and I'm just going to come underneath and find the extent of our picture wall, and scale it up to the length of the dummy wall. So now our plan's in the same scale of the pavilion itself. Next, let's do a little bit of layer management. So let's come up to the layers and we'll delete all of these extra layers that we have. I'm going to create a new layer called picture. I'm going to select the picture and right click and change it to the current picture layer, and then I'm going to lock the picture layer so that we don't accidentally move it. Let's create another layer called module, and let's move all of our bricks onto this layer. Now we want to create the form for both sides of the unzipped wall. I'm going to create a layer called wall 01 and a second layer called wall 02. Within each of these, I'm going to create a sublayer called curves. Let's make this layer a blue color, and we'll do the same thing for the other wall. I'm going to make the curves layer under wall 01 the current layer by double clicking. Now what we want to do is trace the curvature of the picture in plan. Let's create some dummy lines that represent this solid wall so we can turn the module layer off. Let's start in this corner here and draw to the other edge. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side. And then let's turn our module layer off. Let's go into top view and let's start drawing our curves. I'm going to use interp curve, which we used previously. And we're just going to click and approximately get the points going through the curvature that we see in plan. And I'll just add an extra point here, and then snap to that end. So you see the curves encroaching into this zone between those two straight curves. We want to avoid that because that'll cause some issues for our modeling later. If you click once on the curve, you can actually select all the control points and move each of these control points out of that line. So just move these out until we get it approximately right. And that looks pretty good. So next, let's create an interpolate curve, and I'm going to smart track to this edge here, and then I'm going to trace the other side of the wall just like so. We'll just get it approximately right, and then smart track to the end here, like that, and hit return. And now we're going to go back to perspective mode, and I actually want to move these two straight curves upwards to the height of the modules. So let's move them, we'll turn the modules back on and move them up. And then we can turn the modules off. Now I'm going to create a new layer under wall 01, and I'm going to call it loft. And loft is the name of the command we're going to use. Let's make it red. A loft essentially creates an approximate form through some 3D curves. So if we select these two curves and type in loft, so I'll just change my layer to loft, sorry, and we type in loft again, we'll get this surface geometry that approximates between these two curves. Let's do this for the other side as well, so we'll create another loft layer. We'll select the top and the bottom curve and type loft. And now we have an approximation of what the pavilion might look like. I'm not super happy with how it's looking, so let's go to front view and evaluate it a little bit more. I'm going to turn front view to shaded mode. I want to bring in an elevation of the pavilion and compare it to the geometry we've got. So let's bring in this picture into Rhino. So let's right click on this picture and go copy. And we'll make picture the current layer and Control V that into our Rhino model. Now I can't quite see what's going on here, so I'm going to go to top view and just move that picture back so that we can see it properly in right view. I'm also going to change to ghosted mode so I get a bit of an X-ray looking through. So let's just go and try and align this picture to the approximate scale of the pavilion. So I'm going to just move this to that corner there, and then I'm going to scale. We'll just scale from this point here. Doesn't have to be totally accurate. Up to here, just like that, so it's about the right height that we need. And you can kind of see that our lofted form doesn't really follow the actual curvature of the pavilion in elevation. So basically what we want to do is we want to try and replicate this form inside of Rhino. So we need to use a different method or workflow to create this curvature. I'm going to disable our snaps for a second, and then I'm going to make the current layer the curves sublayer in wall 01, just to give us a chance to trace this elevation out and get this curvature correct. So let's create another interp curve, and without any snaps, we're just going to arbitrarily trace over this image, just like this, and we'll just get up to the top there, and now click on it to get the control points, and we want to move out of that zone again where that module wall is. I'll just turn our module layer on again. I'll just massage these points around a little bit. Now it looks okay. So we'll do the same thing for wall 02. And we'll create another interp curve, and from the bottom, we'll just go again. So don't worry about it not snapping and being too accurate just yet, because we'll fix this up in a second. So click again and just make sure that those control points aren't encroaching in that in-between zone of the wall. Cool, that looks good. So now if we go to perspective mode, because we had no snaps on in our front view, all of the curves have been drawn at that flat origin plane, but they're not actually snapping to any of our geometries. So let's select the curve on the right, and we're going to adjust the control points of the first point and the last point of the curve to align and snap to the bottom Z height and the top Z height of the pavilion. Let's select the top control point, and we're just going to turn our snaps back on and move that point back into alignment with the module. And then let's come down to this bottom control point, and we're going to move this as well. And we're going to try and use a smart track to align to this base curve here. So make sure you're snapping to your smart track there. Just get it approximately in the same location, but at the same Z height. That looks good. Now we want to align this to the location of this curvature, which is where this bulge is. So let's draw a line and make sure your quad snap is on. And I'm going to go with this quad and just go directionally out. And then we can do a scale 1D of our profile curve. So we're going to scale it so it comes out to this bulge, and then we're going to move this profile curve into the bulge, and that's where that curve will sit to help give us that shape. So we're essentially creating a 3D wireframe of these bulges. Let's fix up the curve on the other wall. So I'm going to go to the top point, we'll zoom in, and we're going to move that endpoint into the top corner of the wall. We're going to do the same thing for the bottom. We'll get our smart track going and just align that back to the Z height and the approximate location. Now we want to select that curve and we'll do a scale 1D. We're going to scale from this point here out to that profile curve on the base. And now we want to do a copy of this curve. And we're going to copy it to the other end of the pavilion and create another version that scales to the opposite bulge. So we'll select that new copy. We'll do a scale 1D. And we're going to scale it out to this base profile curve again. Now let's turn the picture off, and we're just going to do some layer management because I think these might be on the wrong layer. I'm just going to make sure that they're all correctly on their relevant curve layers. And let's just turn the module layer off as well. So we're trying to create a wireframe of these bulges. Now I want to cap the ends of this front bulge here as well so that it's completely got ends on it. So let's draw some lines. A line from here to here just to cap that end, and a line from here to here to cap that end. I'm going to turn off the back wall and we can see that curve's not on the right layer, so let's change it. And let's just look at this specific wall 1. I'm going to create a new layer in wall 1 called sweep, and this is the new workflow and the new command we're going to use. Let's make it a dark green, and I'm going to make it the current layer. And sweep's the name of the command we're going to be using to turn this wireframe into a 3D geometry. The sweep command essentially creates some 3D geometry along a rail that you define based on some profile curves that run through the rail. There's two types of sweeps you can use, a sweep with one rail and a sweep with two. In this instance, let's use sweep 2. So I'm going to select a top rail and a bottom rail, and then these 3 curves in the middle as our profile curves. And I'll hit return, and we get a preview of this geometry. And let's go OK. Now if we go to top view, we see this bulge is encroaching back into that no-go zone that we were trying to avoid before. So let's undo this sweep, and we're going to add one more profile curve. So let's make curves our current layer, and we're going to draw a line. So we're going to draw a straight line approximately here, just to pull that bulge out. I'll turn the perpendicular snap on, and then we'll do another sweep. We'll make sweep the current layer. We'll select the top curve and the bottom curve, and then our new 4 profile curves. And hit return. We'll just check first. It doesn't look like it's encroaching in, so that's good. We'll go OK. And now we've created the first form of the first wall. So we can go ahead now and do the same thing for wall 02. So let's create a new layer called sweep. We'll make it a dark green and hit OK. And we'll make it the current layer. I'm going to turn wall 1 off. Now we want to make curves the current layer and just create a profile curve straight so we avoid that bulge again just here. Now let's go back to the sweep layer, and we'll type in sweep 2. We'll select the top rail, the bottom rail, and each of these profile curves, and hit return. And now we can look in plan, and we're not encroaching into that zone that we want to avoid. So now we've got basic approximations of these 2 wall geometries in the Serpentine Pavilion. So next we want to create a cavity between these walls, and the cavity is essentially what will contain the box geometry that gives them their thickness inside of the walls. So I'm going to select this wall 1 sweep geometry, and I'm going to do a copy, and I'm going to copy it back 500 millimeters, which is the thickness of our modules. And this creates a cavity between these 2 objects. So what we want is we want it to get thicker at the bulging point and then thin out towards the ends. So I'm going to select the copy that we've made, and we're going to do a scale 1D, and let's go for its base point here. And I'm just going to kind of pull it back a little bit so we get a larger cavity at that bulge area of the pavilion. And what that will mean is we'll have larger boxes in that bulging area in the final pavilion. So let's do the same thing for the second wall. Let's do a copy, 500 millimeters across, and then let's select it and do a scale 1D from the origin, and just try and get a bit of a larger cavity where those 2 bulges are happening on this wall. Just like that. So now we're ready to start creating some boxes. I'm going to come to wall 01 and create a new layer called trim. Let's make trim the current layer, and we'll make it magenta. Let's turn off wall 02 for a second, and we want to copy one of the module boxes over to the trim layer. Let's copy this base box at the bottom here, and then we'll turn module off. And I want to make it a really long box, so let's use the gumball to stretch it, and we'll just move it into alignment with the pavilion. What we're trying to do here is create another dummy wall with all of these trimmed pieces of geometry. So we're going to array these long boxes just like our module wall. We're going to do one thing differently, however, because if you look at the module wall in the Pavilion, it's actually got a bit of a checkerboard pattern where every second module is missing. So instead of arraying by 500, let's array by 1000. And we want to do half the number of what we did in our previous array. So we'll go with 27. So let's go array linear 27. And that's looking good. And I know that the geometry on this side of the pavilion is actually offset, so let's select all those arrays and we're going to move them 500 across. And then we're going to do a copy of this array upwards to get that checkerboard pattern. And we'll come over here to the left and just delete this extra piece. And now we want to array this collection of checkerboard geometry. So let's go array linear again. And we're going to do half of what our heart was. So I think that's going to be 17. And so that goes up to the top there and looks good because it encapsulates that entire wall geometry. So now we want to use the trim command. We've used this command previously to trim out a surface, but we can use it on other geometry types because you're essentially just trimming one geometry with another geometry. So we're going to trim all these boxes so that they fill the cavity between those two surfaces. Let's go to top view and I'm going to select the green geometry on the left-hand side. And I'm just going to trim out this whole left-hand side of our magenta trim geometry. So let's type in trim, and just as a warning, this is quite a slow command, so we're only going to do a few at a time and just go slow. And let's just do this much, and I want you to go really slow, and I'm going to speed up my video until I've completed them all. So my trimming is complete, and now if we go to perspective mode, and turn our sweep off, you can see that we've got a trimmed version of those boxes we've created. So now we're going to do the same thing for the other side. So I'm going to select this right-hand wall and we're going to trim again to get that cavity geometry with the trimmed geometry. Once again, go slow with this and I'm going to speed my video up and skip ahead. Great, so the trimming's done and I'm going to turn my sweep layer off and we're going to go back into perspective. So we're pretty close to the geometry of the pavilion now. It's really starting to look a lot like the Serpentine pavilion itself. The main thing that's different here is that the pavilion's actually made up of very rectilinear boxes. It doesn't have this curvaceous trim on it. So let's go to our layers and we're going to create a new layer called boxes. Going to make it a lavender color and we'll hit OK. And we'll make boxes the current layer. And we're now going to use a command called bounding box. So what a bounding box is it's essentially a box that encapsulates a geometry whilst being in alignment to a plane. So in this case, our C plane. So let's type in bounding box. And I'm going to select this box here to start with. And watch your command line, make sure that you have cumulative equals no selected and your output is solids. And then you'll get a box around your geometry that aligns to the C plane. Now the beauty of this is that we can actually select multiple geometries and do this all at once. So I'm going to select all of the geometry on my boxes layer and do another bounding box. Make sure cumulative is set to no and output to solids. And this will go and create a nice box around every single one of those trimmed boxes. And we can turn that trim layer off. And now we're really, really close to the geometry of that Serpentine pavilion. Now I'm going to pause the video here and skip ahead and do the exact same workflow for the other side of the wall. And I encourage you to do the same. Great, so I've gone ahead and modeled that second wall and I've got the entire geometry for the pavilion pretty much complete and ready. There's one last little tweak that I want to make to the pavilion before we're finished modeling. You'd notice in the actual pavilion that these boxes are actually open-ended. They're not closed-off boxes. So we want to open up those ends of each of these boxes so we get that transparency coming through in the side elevations. There's a few ways that you could get rid of these. You could come into the boxes and do a shift-control click on each of the faces and just hit delete, but this would take you an enormous amount of time. So one workflow that might be helpful to do this is, let's go into our write mode and we're just going to turn shaded view on. We can use the delete faces command, which we used previously in the tutorial, to select all of the faces in our pavilion. So any face that we've selected, if we hit return, they'll just be gone right now. But what we want to do right now is go through each row and column and deselect all of the faces that are visible in this right view. So if you go through and deselect all of these rows and columns with the control key held down, you'll actually go into perspective mode and notice I'm deselecting all of those faces that we want to keep. But I'm going to be keeping the front faces that we want to delete. So if you do that for all the rows and columns, it's the quickest way to get rid of all of those front faces for this geometry. So I'm going to go through and do this, and I'm going to skip my video ahead because it's going to take maybe 5 minutes to go through and select them all. Cool, that's the last row there done. And now if we jump over to perspective mode, you can see I've deselected all those faces, and if I hit return, it'll delete all of those front faces that we wanted to remove. And now I've completed the modeling of the Serpentine Pavilion by Bjarke Ingels.